On a warm morning in August 2023, Alberto Carvalho stood before cameras at Los Angeles Unified School District headquarters and introduced ED, an artificial intelligence chatbot built to call families, flag absences, and catch struggling students before they fell through the cracks. He called it revolutionary. But the company behind ED was already running out of money, and the contracts it had used to win Los Angeles's trust barely existed. Behind the podium, past the banners and the promises, a much smaller and much shakier company was quietly burning through what little cash remained. Its founder, Smith-Griffin, had spent years building a story about a chatbot that could reach families no school could reach on its own. A story compelling enough to draw investors, superintendents, and eventually a governor into the same room. That story would collapse within a year, taking with it 50 jobs, a bankruptcy filing, and a federal indictment accusing the founder of running a scheme to defraud the people who had trusted her with their money. What happened between that stage in August 2023 and the silence that followed less than a year later is a story about how easy it can be to sell an idea before the product behind it is real, and how far that gap can travel before anyone stops to check the numbers. The trail leads through school district boardrooms, bankruptcy court, and eventually the doorstep of the superintendent who once called this technology the future of education. This is the story of AllHere Education. AllHere Education began in 2016, founded by Smith-Griffin inside the Harvard Innovation Lab. The pitch was simple and appealing. Build a chatbot capable of engaging families directly in their own language to cut down on chronic absenteeism, one of the most stubborn problems in American public education. Investors liked the mission. School districts, desperate for tools that could reach disengaged families at scale, liked it even more. Federal prosecutors would later say the fraud they allege began around November 2020 and continued through June 2024, a window of roughly 3.5 years during which Smith-Griffin is accused of misrepresenting the company's financial health to keep investor money flowing. According to the indictment, the gap between what AllHere claimed and what AllHere actually had was enormous. In 2020, the company's real annual revenue was just $11,000, with only $494,000 in cash on hand. Those numbers bore little resemblance to the picture prosecutors say was presented to investors. Part of that picture depended on contracts. According to the indictment, only 2 school systems actually had signed agreements with AllHere during the period in question: Boston Public Schools and Prince George's County Public Schools in Maryland. Contracts the company claimed to hold with the New York City Department of Education and Atlanta Public Schools, prosecutors allege, did not exist at all. For a company built entirely on the premise of trust between technology and school districts, the foundation prosecutors describe was thinner than anyone outside the company understood. The mechanism behind the company's growth was not unusual in early-stage technology. A founder pitches a vision, secures money against projected contracts, and uses each signed district as proof that the next contract is inevitable. Investors wire money based on trajectory, not necessarily on audited revenue. In AllHere's case, prosecutors allege that trajectory was manufactured, inflated projections, borrowed credibility from institutions that were not actually paying customers, and eventually fabricated documentation sent directly to the company's largest backer. None of that was visible to school administrators evaluating a chatbot demo. From their vantage point, AllHere looked like a company already succeeding elsewhere, which made it easier to sign the next contract, and the next. In late 2022, Miami-Dade County Public Schools approved a 3-year contract with AllHere worth roughly $1.8 million. The bidding process had started while Alberto Carvalho was still superintendent there, though the school board did not approve the agreement until October 2022. About 8 months after Carvalho left Miami to take the top job at Los Angeles Unified. The timing would later draw scrutiny, but at the time it looked like nothing more than one large district validating a promising vendor. Carvalho brought that same interest in education technology to Los Angeles. In 2023, LAUSD signed a work order with AllHere worth $6 million over 5 years to build a chatbot the district would eventually call ED. For AllHere, the contract was transformative, the largest single deal in the company's short history, and one that came with the credibility of the second-largest school district in the country attached to it. By August 2023, Carvalho was ready to introduce ED publicly, describing it as the newest student advisor for the district. The rollout itself did not begin until March 2024, when the district launched ED at 100 schools identified as among its lowest performing, the exact population the chatbot had been designed to serve. It was, on paper, the kind of milestone that could define a company, a flagship deployment inside one of the most closely watched school systems in the country, launched with fanfare and political backing. That backing was real. Governor Gavin Newsom and Mayor Karen Bass both attended the public inauguration of ED, standing alongside university and business partners gathered to watch the chatbot go live. For a company that, according to federal prosecutors, had spent years inflating its financial picture to investors, this was the moment the story converged with reality, a real launch in a real district in front of real cameras. What almost no one in that room could see was how little runway remained behind the presentation. The cracks did not appear in a boardroom or a courtroom. They appeared inside the company's own engineering team, months before the public launch. Chris Whiteley, a senior director of software engineering at AllHere, had spent time examining how ED handled student information, the kind of data covering attendance records and identifying details about the children the chatbot was built to contact. What he found concerned him enough to raise it internally, warning that the protections around that student data were not where they needed to be. Whiteley was laid off in April 2024, roughly a month after ED's public rollout began. He later spoke publicly about the concerns he had raised, concerns that reached lost as the district was already relying on the chatbot to reach families at 100 schools. For a product built specifically to text and call students' families using their own data, a gap in data protection was not a minor technical footnote. It went to the core of what the tool was supposed to safely do. At almost the same moment, the financial picture inside AllHere was deteriorating in ways that had nothing to do with data protection and everything to do with cash. The company had built its growth on a small number of large contracts: Boston, Prince George's County, Miami, and now Los Angeles. But contracts on paper are not the same as cash in hand, especially when a company's actual revenue, as prosecutors would later allege, had been a fraction of what was claimed to investors for years. $6 million spread across 5 years does not arrive all at once, and a company burning through cash faster than contracts pay out has only two options: raise more money or run out. Investigators would later allege that Smith-Griffin took a further step to keep the illusion running, creating a fake email address posing as an outside financial consultant, then using that invented persona to send fabricated financial documents directly to AllHere's largest investor. If accurate, that step marks the difference between a founder stretching optimistic projections and a deliberate effort to manufacture evidence for someone specifically positioned to ask hard questions. It is the kind of move that only becomes necessary when the real numbers can no longer survive an outside look. Precisely the position AllHere was allegedly in as it pursued its highest-profile launch yet. Two systems were converging that spring: a technical warning about data protection inside a live product used by children, and a financial warning, known only to a few, about a company that could not sustain what it had promised. Neither warning stopped the show that was about to go on stage with a governor and a mayor in attendance. The show ended quickly. On June 14, 2024, barely 3 months after ED's rollout began, AllHere posted a notice on its own website informing employees that most of its roughly 50-person staff were being furloughed, citing its financial position. Joanna Smith-Griffin left her role as chief executive the same day. The chatbot that had launched with a governor and a mayor in attendance went dark for the district relying on it. By that point, LAUSD had already paid AllHere approximately $3 million toward the development of ED. The district ended its relationship with the company once the collapse became public, left with a chatbot it could no longer operate, and a vendor that no longer had staff to support it. Months later, when AllHere filed for bankruptcy, the LAUSD contract itself was listed among the company's largest remaining assets, valued in those filings at $2.88 million, a figure close to, but not identical to, the amount the district said it had already paid. The discrepancy is a reminder of how differently a contract can be valued depending on whether it is viewed as future revenue on a bankruptcy schedule or as money already spent by a public school system. In September 2024, AllHere entered Chapter 7 bankruptcy, full liquidation, not reorganization. Every employee had already been let go, and a court-appointed trustee took control of what remained of the company. There was no path back. The chatbot built to call families about absent children had itself gone silent, and the company behind it no longer existed in any operating form. 2 months later, on November 19, 2024, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York unsealed an indictment against Joanna Smith-Griffin. She was arrested that day at her home in Raleigh, North Carolina. The charges: securities fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft, tied to what prosecutors describe as a scheme to defraud investors of close to $10 million. The indictment lays out specific allegations, including a fabricated consultant email used to send false financial documents to AllHere's largest investor, and at least $600,000 in company funds prosecutors say Smith-Griffin diverted for personal use, including a down payment on her North Carolina home and the cost of her own wedding in 2021. If convicted on every count, Smith-Griffin faces a maximum of 20 years in prison for securities fraud, another maximum of 20 years for wire fraud, and a mandatory 2-year sentence for aggravated identity theft, a term that does not run alongside the others but is added on top. Those numbers represent maximum exposure under the charges as filed, not a verdict. Smith-Griffin has been charged, not convicted, and the criminal case remains to be decided in court. The collapse of AllHere did not end with the company's bankruptcy or the founder's arrest. It reopened questions about the district that had championed the chatbot loudest. In February 2026, FBI agents executed search warrants at the home and office of lost Superintendent Alberto Carvalho, and separately at the Florida home of Deborah Kerr, a consultant who had worked part-time for AllHere since 2022 as its self-described chief growth officer. Kerr later surfaced in AllHere's bankruptcy filings as a creditor, claiming she was owed money tied to the lost deal. Reports of the exact figure vary, with bankruptcy documents citing roughly $630,000, an amount that outside observers noted lines up closely with a 10% commission on the value of the lost contract. Carvalho was placed on paid administrative leave immediately after the February raids. He remained on leave for about 4 months before resigning as superintendent on June 21, 2026, effective immediately. The school board did not vote to remove him. It simply acknowledged receipt of his resignation letter. No charges have been filed against Carvalho or Kerr in connection with the investigation, and LAUSD itself is treated in court filings as an alleged victim of AllHere, a district that paid for services prosecutors say were never fully delivered. The AllHere collapse is not really a story about artificial intelligence. The chatbot itself, the technology meant to call families and flag absences, was almost incidental to what went wrong. The failure sat one layer beneath the product, in the gap between what a company reports and what a company actually has, and in how long that gap can survive if enough institutions choose not to look closely. Every stage of AllHere's rise depended on borrowed credibility. A Harvard incubator lent it legitimacy at the start. A handful of school district contracts, some real and some allegedly fabricated, lent it legitimacy to investors. And a flagship launch inside the second-largest school district in the country, attended by a governor and a mayor, lent it legitimacy to everyone watching from outside. At no point in that chain did the credibility depend on an audited financial statement matching the story being told. It depended on the next institution trusting the last one enough not to ask. That mechanism is worth remembering because it is not unique to education technology. Any sector where public institutions buy from young, unaudited private companies, where a signed contract is treated as proof of stability rather than simply a hope of future revenue, creates the same opening. A district evaluating a vendor rarely has the tools or the incentive to verify a company's cash position the way an accountant would. It sees a product demo, a client list, a polished founder. AllHere's own numbers, $11,000 in real 2020 revenue against a far larger sum reportedly presented to investors, show how wide that blind spot can be. The warning signs, when they appeared, came from the people closest to the work rather than from the institutions writing the checks. An engineer flagged a data protection concern before the public ever knew the company was in trouble. A financial reality far worse than the pitch had been building for years before an indictment made it public. In both cases, the information existed inside the company long before it became visible outside it. What remains unresolved reaches beyond AllHere itself. The criminal case against Smith-Griffin is pending, with no conviction and no admission of guilt. The investigation into the lost contract, which led federal agents to a sitting superintendent's home and to a consultant's door in Florida, has not produced charges against either of them. What is settled is simpler and more limited. A company built on a promising idea ran out of money faster than anyone outside its walls understood, and a public school system paid millions of dollars before finding out. Disclaimer: this program does not allege that any living person named is guilty of a crime. Joanna Smith-Griffin has been indicted by federal prosecutors on charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. She has not been convicted, and the criminal case against her remains pending in federal court. Alberto Carvalho and Deborah Kerr have not been charged with any crime in connection with the investigation into the lost contract described in this program. All individuals discussed are presumed innocent, unless and until proven guilty in a court of law.